I have a big problem, and that is my art sucks. Now I know what you're thinking. You should be your biggest art supporter, and in this case it's not true, because I don't really believe in the creative process I'm currently implementing. So, to understand why my art sucks, let's first dive into my creative process in general. I first start out by finding a reference photo, and then I pretty much copy it, and then I repeat the process. And as a result of this, you can see how my artwork almost became pretty factory-like. It had no meaning to it besides the fact that I just liked drawing pretty pictures. So I needed to change the way I made art. I wanted to approach this as a scientist would almost approach a big problem they might have. I don't have any art training besides some art classes in college, and I graduated with a STEM degree and I'm currently in grad school, but not for art. And so I did this the best way I knew how by using the empirical approach. It's weird, but I think it worked in my favor. So before I begin, I wanted to talk about what successfully creating art was for me. I think art is a very subjective and personal experience, and for me, creating art required me to tell a story, or almost elicit an emotion I wanted. In order to do this, I needed a larger sample size with controlled variables. I told myself I would draw for an entire month, taking no shorter than an hour a day. This would result in me having a larger area of artwork that I could start comparing and contrasting to what I actually liked. So these were the results the first 2 weeks. So the first 2 weeks, I stayed with the boring, almost sterile-looking charcoal portraits. The black and white of the charcoal almost felt like it sucked the soul out of the drawing, and I realized this and I started adding color to it, and it didn't do much but contrast it more, so it made it look even more like a corpse. But I was comfortable with it. Charcoal was initially what I felt like I excelled at, and as a result, departing from it was a difficult thing to really put my head around. I liked the comfort of charcoal portraits, but ultimately I realized that this type of artwork was just copying a picture in grayscale. I wanted to draw and create, not be a photographer. So I realized that in order to do this, I had to sacrifice my comfort and actually make things I wanted to enjoy and design. So for me, I had a big issue. The art I loved and the art I made were disconnected. I still had a lot to learn, but I wanted to continue to create, so I did away with the charcoal and I started drawing on a larger scale. I got colored pencils and I started reviewing what worked and what didn't work. So in research, there's this thing called a literary analysis or literary review. And pretty much, this is where a scientist or a student will look over the current topics of a niche they want to look into. So maybe it's stem cells or maybe it's something else. But in this case, it was why my art sucked. And to do this, I needed a good control, or I needed some art that I looked up to. And for me, one artist in particular stood out. His name was Alvaro Escobar, and I could be pronouncing this wrong, so bear with me. But he creates these modern-looking portraits that combine almost elements of pop art. And so I started comparing my work to work that I wanted to implement more of, and I found these 3 things that were consistent that I was lacking. So the first thing was color. It can't be added simply as a background in hopes of making it more interesting. It had to be used intentionally, and it had to be used to build the image I wanted it to. The second was line. There's a certain emotion that comes from cross-hatching itself, and it felt like I had to add movement not typically seen in a normal portrait. In my previous charcoal portraits, I wasn't confident enough in my lines. As a result, I would rub them out a lot, and then I would put them back in and rub and put them back in, and it left this kind of muddy looking mess. Next was the background. Some of my favorite work is where the background also reflects the character of the portrait. And I realized that I was using the background as a second thought, and to combat this, I decided that I needed to add a more interesting background. But there was one big issue still at hand. I couldn't currently use my creative process that I had started my entire art journey and rely on it for this. I wouldn't be able to create. I wouldn't be able to make artwork that seemed interesting. So to do this, I restructured my creative process. I drew artwork and then I built references around it, as opposed to using references only to base artwork off of. That sounds convoluted and a little complicated, but pretty much I trusted my artistic instinct first and then found references to match it. I realized I was kind of scared of the color white, and so I started toning my paper in neutral colors. It helped me depart from how scary the white surface could be. I wanted to save my whites for last to really add that pop of highlight, but instead of doing my background last, I wanted to first start out with the background. Start with the tone of how I wanted the portrait to look like. And then I would start with the portrait. And instead of being a copy machine or a photographer, I wanted to choose the colors that made sense for me. And that's what I did. I started matching the value of the shadows, but not necessarily the color or the hue that was associated with the shadows. And as a result, I started to create work that felt more interesting and personal to me. I was able to convey a story and emotion, and it felt pretty good. There was still something nagging at me though, and I think that nagging was that I had a lot left unfinished I wanted to explore. You see, when you get into the habit of just copying portraits from references, you miss out on a massive opportunity to draw and create. You miss out on telling your own story, and you miss out on the ideas that many artists before you fought really hard to make. And so I realized that creativity can't be materialized in thin air. It's alive and it's a thoughtful process that you have to walk hand in hand with. I realized that artists are mosaics of things as they love, and by limiting myself to references that I may or may not find, I was ultimately limiting what I was giving out to the world. So I hope this helps give a little bit of insight to how I want to be as an artist and how I want to continue to create. And if you have any comments or feedback about this process or any critiques, I will gladly accept it. So that's pretty much all I have for this video, but I appreciate you bearing with me as I trauma dump of sorts about my creative process. If you have any questions, let me know. I'll link my Instagram in the bio, and you can always message me on there. But yeah, I hope you have a good day today.